Hello, I'm Emily Rhodes, and thank you so much for tuning in to this month's webcast, which is about Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont by Elizabeth Taylor. A great book, which I hope many of you will have read and many more of you will read after listening to this. First of all, forgive my very husky voice. If only it were because I had spent all last night out on the town drinking and chain smoking. But actually it's because unfortunately I got rather poorly after my summer holiday. I think the shock of returning to London life took its toll. So yes, forgive the graveliness. So let me tell you a little bit about Mrs. Palfrey at the Claremont. It is about Mrs. Palfrey, Laura Palfrey, who the book opens as she arrives at the Claremont Hotel, which is in London's South Kensington. It's a funny place. It's kind of slightly genteel and also slightly seedy, I would say, the Claremont. It's not the Ritz, there's nothing mega smart about it. The dinner menu, notoriously is on rotation and it doesn't sound nice at all. In fact, one of the things we loved discussing was the food in the book and sort of how disgustorous it sounds. So she arrives at the Claremont really to end her days. There are a few other elderly residents, long-term residents, and they stay there at a reduced rate. It's not quite a nursing home. You have to be kind of in full control of all your bodily functions, I could say. And it's a rather sad moment when one of the long-term residents has to leave because she has become incontinent, and the kind Irish maid who tries to cover up for her can't continue to cover up, so she gets sort of shuffled off to a rather nasty nursing home and dies soon afterwards, which is quite sad. And in fact, this book is really sad, but it is also really funny. It is so well observed. There are so many brilliant one-liners. And what makes the sadness so intensely felt, I think, is the moments of real pure joy and emotion that are also in this book. So it's not just about Mrs. Palfrey. You can see from this cover that there's also someone else in the book. This is Ludo, a young writer who is also alone in South Kensington, kind of lonely, kind of having lost his way a bit. And Mrs. Palfrey and Ludo have a chance encounter, and they enter into this wonderful sort of life-affirming, joy-giving relationship based on this kind of lie that she pretends that he is her grandson because her real grandson is completely horrid and awful and never comes to visit her. And he happily goes along with it. There's a complicated level to their relationship because Ludo, is a writer and decides he's going to use Mrs. Palfrey and the Claremont as inspiration for his book. So one feels that he is using her, but he is also giving her so much. So there's much more to be said about the relationship. As well as these two characters, there are loads of people in this book. There's this kind of amazing cast, really. There are all the other elderly residents at the hotel. There's Ludo's kind of rather hopeless mother and her mother's partner, who's even more useless. There's this kind of glamorous 60s girl, Rosie, who is also quite horrid, who Ludo picks up at a laundrette. I should just say laundrettes are a subject rather close to my heart at the moment. So we got home, and as well as getting ill, our washing machine broke. So that was a bit of a nightmare. But not to get distracted, there's Rosie. There is Mrs. Palfrey's family. So she's got a rather unloving daughter, Elizabeth, who she writes letters to, and also her real grandson, Desmond, who is beyond the pale of grim. So we had a little chat on the Walking Book Club about the different characters. We kind of went through them all, thought of moments that they came alive, what defined each character, their quirks, their characteristics. And we had a bit of an argument as to whether or not they were realistically portrayed and well realised, rounded characters, or kind of caricatures, especially the other elderly characters who some of us in the group felt rather strongly were just totally wrong. They were caricatures, they were badly drawn, they were not done well at all. Whereas other members actually really felt they could relate to them and could see them very clearly. So this was an aspect of the book on which we all disagreed. But we did agree that all the characters really were, well, firstly, that none of them was straightforwardly good, really. That, I talked a little bit there about how Ludo is both very kind to Mrs. Palfrey, but is also using her. And the other inhabitants of the hotel, you feel there is some goodness there, but there's also some real meanness and sourness, and perhaps that is what for me felt really well observed about them, that there weren't all saints, all baddies, they were all, a bit of both. But the other thing we agreed on was that all these characters were incredibly lonely, and how sad that is, and how, again, perhaps that's something that many of us could relate to. I think we've all had lonely times in our lives, especially given the past couple of years. One way I think that Elizabeth Taylor, who is such a great writer, gets this loneliness across so well is her device of the characters writing letters. So there's a really brilliant scene where Ludo is shown writing to his mother, and she takes us back to his childhood task on a Sunday. So he writes a letter on a Sunday of writing letters home from boarding school, and how tears would sometimes fall on the page, and those early Sundays of his life were some of the worst. Mrs. Palfrey writes letters to her daughter which are so completely unreflective of how she's feeling. They're such a lie. And Mr. Osmond, who's one of the residents of the hotel, who many of us felt rather fond of, he's always trying to tell slightly rude stories and things. He has no one to write letters to. So he just endlessly writes letters to the Times and tries to read them out to people. So somehow letter writing, which should be such an intimate exchange, becomes this way of really showing the lack of this relationship in their lives. I think that this book does so many things. It's about relationships, about aging, it's about the 60s when it was set. I think it's also very much a city novel, a novel about London. It's so very much set in South Kensington. And there's a little bit I want to read out that I think captures an aspect of this Londonness of the book, and also a little bit about why I love Mrs. Palfrey herself so much and how much I respect her. Right. It's on page 8, by the way. As she waited for prunes, Mrs. Palfrey considered the day ahead. The morning was to be filled in quite nicely, but the afternoon and evening made a long stretch. I must not wish my life away, she told herself. But she knew that as she got older, she looked at her watch more often, and that it was always earlier than she had thought it would be. When she was young, it had always been later. I could go to the Victoria and Albert Museum, she thought, yet had a feeling that this would somehow be deferred until another day. There was always so much going on in London, she had told her daughter, who had suggested Eastbourne as a more suitable place for her to live. In London, there were a great many free entertainments and a great diversity of people. Net curtains covered the windows of the dining room, but she had a feeling that it had begun to rain again. When she had finished breakfast, she went out into the vestibule and stood by the revolving doors, looking at the people scuttling by in the wet road, bowed under umbrellas, splashed by buses, going to work. It was a proper Monday morning, Mrs. Palfrey decided, and she went to the lounge and began a cheerful letter to her daughter. At 11, she decided to brave it and set out to post her letter and do her shopping. This took up much less time than she had planned, and, in spite of her varicose veins, she walked all round a neighbouring square. In the gardens, in the centre, were asphalt paths, a summer house and dripping shrubs. The square was like a dog's lavatory. All the peaks and poodles from the nearby blocks of flats had made their little messes by the railings. She had to keep an eye on the pavement. I shall be able to watch the lilacs coming out, she thought. It will be just like the garden at Rottingdean. The setting could scarcely have been more different, but she felt a determination about the lilac trees. They were to be a part of her rules, her code of behaviour. Be independent, never give way to melancholy, never touch capital. And she had abided by the rules. At 12 o'clock she returned. She'd been out an hour. It's so sad, and I think there are fewer lonelier places than the city, especially London, the capital city, where you feel there's so much going on, there are so many other people, and yet it's so easy to feel disconnected from everything and to feel like somehow you're missing it all. But, the city does also get you out onto its streets, and it is the streets itself that allow these kind of chance encounters. So Mrs. Palfrey, who's busy avoiding the dog poo on the pavement, I definitely know that feeling, especially sort of steering children through all the dog poo. It's so annoying. She has a fall, and it is when she has fallen that she's rescued by Ludo, and he kind of bandages her up, and that is where their friendship begins. If she hadn't been in London, if she hadn't been on those slippery London streets, she wouldn't have fallen and he wouldn't have found her. The city is both really alienating and so full of potential. So I think we've got to forgive the city a little bit. There's so much to say about this book. There's so much to explore in the relationship between Ludo and Mrs. Palfrey, how he kind of exhilarates her and then disappoints her, and the sort of highs and lows that he brings to her life, and also what she brings to his life, which is so touching. And, towards the end of the book, where Mrs. Palfrey, well, without wanting to give too much away, does really decline a little bit. And it is so emotional watching the scene where Ludo is beside her and, she's really gone downhill. And actually many of us really found it very intense. One reader on the Zoom talked about how she'd been reading it in the park and had been, in floods of tears, and how embarrassing that had been. And actually someone else on the Zoom actually started crying as she talked about this bit. And we did first discuss this book a decade ago in an earlier walking book club. And this time round, it felt much sadder. I don't know if that's just because we've all got a bit older, or if there's something about it being read post-COVID when, we were all alone and we did all grieve. We were all touched by death, I think, in some way over those years. And also, of course, reading it in the wake of the Queen. So we, on our walk, we held a minute's silence and thought about her. And this was also in part a memorial walk for one of our walking book clubbers, Carrie, who loved this book. So yes, it is a terribly emotional, moving, sad book, but one that has these brilliant flashes of wit and brightness and life. And I think that is what makes this a fantastic book. I'm going to briefly show you our next one. Thank you so much for tuning in. See you next time.